And we're speaking with Dr. Ira Helfand. He is the immediate past president of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, a member of the steering committee of ICAN, the International Committee Against Nuclear Weapons, and also on the board of Physicians for Social Responsibility. Plus, he's on the steering committee of a brand new campaign called the Back from the Brink campaign. Welcome.
Good to be here.
So I wanted to start off by talking about the changes that we've seen in our fairly recent lifetime in terms of attitudes about nuclear weapons and nuclear war. Certainly in the 1980s, there was television specials like The Day After Tomorrow, and there was a fair amount of awareness and anxiety on the part of young people about whether or not they would survive into the future because of the threat of nuclear war. Where are we today?
Well, it's interesting. I think over time, the big inflection point was the end of the Cold War. Prior to that, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was somewhat less degree in the later 60s and 70s, very much so in the early 80s, people were terrified of nuclear war. We thought it was going to happen. And we acted accordingly. We tried to do things to minimize the danger, organized politically millions of people in the United States, in Europe, even in the Soviet Union, in Japan, Australia, and actually had a very profound impact on public policy. When the Cold War ended, I can remember it, there was this palpable sense of relief that the Cold War is over, we dodged the nuclear bullet. And people really put this out of mind. Part of it was just a celebration of the fact that we had survived. And part of it, I think, was a determination we're never going to think about this again because it was so awful. And there was an extended period of time in the 90s and early 2000s when people really did not pay much attention to this issue at all. We all acted as though the danger had gone away, even though it clearly had not. It wasn't as bad as it was during the Cold War, but there were still thousands of warheads around and the potential for bad things to happen. Interest began to tick up again, I think maybe around 2007 or 8 or 9 when the first studies were published on limited nuclear war. And the fact that even a war that involved only like 0.5% of the world's nuclear arsenals could cause worldwide famine and catastrophic consequences for human civilization. When that data started to get publicized in the late 2000s, interest started to tick up. And then it has progressively become more a subject of concern as US-Russian relations, US-Chinese relations, the North Korean situation, India-Pakistan, those situations have all played out. And of course, with the invasion of Ukraine, there's been a very marked increase in people's awareness of the fact that nuclear weapons are still with us and they constitute a huge problem.
Well, you yourself have written a book on nuclear famine, and it's interesting because, again, looking back at the 80s, people sort of had the opinion that a nuclear war was all or nothing. Now we have people in the military that are believing that you can fight a limited tactical nuclear war on a battlefield. How did that change?
Yeah, this is a terrible example of an important lesson that's been unlearned. Back in the 80s, people understood, because they did war games, they gamed out what would happen if we tried to have a limited nuclear war. And what they found was every time either side, the Soviet Union, the United States, used a tactical nuclear weapon, that is to say battlefield nuclear weapon, it always escalated to all-out nuclear war. And it's like a vampire. The stake hasn't been placed firmly enough in its heart. This idea has resurfaced that we can somehow fight a limited nuclear war, gain some kind of advantage over somebody in some domain, and not have the whole world collapse around us. And I think, people have started to look again more seriously at what does happen if nuclear weapons are used on the battlefield, and have again are coming to the conclusion that this does not end well, that this escalates to all-out war. But also we've learned, as a result of some very important studies done in the 2000s, that even a limited nuclear war, one that involves a relatively small portion of the world's nuclear arsenals, would have catastrophic worldwide effects. A group of climate scientists led by Alan Robach and Brian Toon and their colleagues published papers in 2006 that first looked at this. what would happen if India and Pakistan went to war, and showed that even if they used 100 Hiroshima-sized bombs in total, that would be enough to cause worldwide climate disruption. And in the years following that, a number of food scientists, notably Lily Jia, published papers looking at what exactly would happen. And there were limited studies, but there were enough to suggest that huge numbers of people would be at risk. In the paper that I wrote that you referred to, we identified 2 billion people who, because of food insecurity issues, would be at risk of starvation in the event of a nuclear war. What has changed recently is that Lily Jia and her colleagues have published an extremely powerful study. It was just released in August of this year, that looks at what will happen to food supply in the event of a limited war between India and Pakistan. And they looked at a number of different scenarios, different levels of intensity of warfare. And the results have just been horrifying. They project that at the very lowest level of the range they studied, hundreds of millions of people will die. And in the largest plausible war that they could imagine currently between India and Pakistan, over 2 billion people would die. Not that they would be at risk, as we had previously indicated, but actually over 2 billion people would die. And this is astonishing data that underlines the utter urgency of getting these weapons eliminated before any of them are used.
And you've said a couple times now, if India and Pakistan were to go to war, and of course, these are two small countries, relatively small countries, not in population, but in geographic size. On the other side of the world, we don't think about them that much here, and yet India and Pakistan are both nuclear-armed nations and have both had numerous conflicts over the past 70 years.
Exactly. India and Pakistan have gone to war 4 times since they became independent nations in the 1940s, and they almost went to war in 2019. And people who look closely at this issue say that if they go to war again, it is highly likely that this will involve the use of nuclear weapons. India is a much more powerful country in terms of its conventional forces. Pakistan has an explicit doctrine that if Indian forces cross into Pakistan, Pakistan will counter that by using nuclear weapons on the battlefield against those invading forces. And India has said that if Pakistan uses nuclear weapons at all, India will retaliate against Pakistani cities, and then it just escalates from there. And they each have about 150, 160 nuclear warheads at this time. They're adding to their nuclear arsenals at a rapid rate. And this is an extraordinarily dangerous situation, and one that's going to get worse as the climate crisis progresses, because we've seen the terrible flooding in Pakistan this year. That's one of the environmental problems that climate change is causing. But the other is the ultimate drying up of the Indus River, on whose waters both India and Pakistan are dependent. And as that happens, as the water flow in the Indus decreases over the next several decades, there's going to be incredibly intense competition between these two countries for that very precious and increasingly scarce resource. And that sets the stage for conflict and for war and for nuclear war.
So the climate crisis could actually precipitate a warfare crisis as well. And India and Pakistan being one of those places, what are some of the other tension points, if you will, that really make this concern over nuclear warfare particularly prominent today?
Well, I mean, there are several existing geopolitical rivalries that are fraught with danger. U.S.-Russian relations are clearly the worst they've been since the end of the Cold War, and it is an overtly hostile relationship at this point, with explicit nuclear threatening going on, primarily from the Russian side, but occasionally from the NATO side as well. U.S.-China relations are the worst they've been since the 1970s, and there is a clearly identified potential point of conflict over Taiwan, which could lead to nuclear war. The situation in North Korea got a lot of attention here in the United States about 4 or 5 years ago. There's been less attention to it recently, although that's starting to change again also as North Korea conducts more missile tests, and there has been real concern that they're about to conduct some additional nuclear tests also. So US-China, US-Russia, Korea, and India-Pakistan are the 4 major points of geopolitical rivalry that could lead to nuclear war at this point.
And then there's also the accidental or at least not state-sponsored possibility of a nuclear terrorist attack.
Yes, you know, we are now told that the thing we need to worry about with regards to terrorists is that they are potentially able to commit a cyber attack to hack into the command and control systems of a nuclear state and either directly launch that country's weapons or perhaps more likely create a false alert that convinces the country being hacked that they are actually under nuclear attack and induces them to launch their weapons. And it doesn't necessarily even need to be a deliberate terrorist attack. There's just the danger of a cyber accident. There have been multiple instances during the course of the nuclear weapons era when either Moscow or Washington believed it was under attack by the other side because of computer mistakes, problems in interpreting the data that was coming into radar stations and so on. And in each of these circumstances, either Moscow or Washington actually began the process of preparing a nuclear attack in the belief that it was itself already under attack. So yeah, I mean, a true accident in that sense, not even something that's triggered by a terrorist group.
Now, as we sit here today, we're pretty much smack dab in the middle of the 60th anniversary of those 13 days in October 1962 that we refer to as the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that really was also a potential crisis of communication, wasn't it? I mean, the fact that as we found out, 30 years later, the control of those Soviet missiles based in Cuba had devolved down to some lower level troops in the field who basically could have set those off at any moment. What are the lessons that we learned in October 1962 out of the fear of a potential catastrophic event?
Well, the lessons are particularly relevant today because of the crisis in Ukraine, in which there are many direct parallels. The underlying one is that simply when in a crisis situation, there is the fog of war. We don't know what the other side is doing, and they don't know what we're doing. And during the Cuban crisis, we did not know that the Soviets had already stationed nuclear weapons in Cuba. We didn't know that they had given command of those to local commanders. And in that ignorance, it was advocated in the United States that we should launch a military attack against Cuba. Had we done that, there would have been World War III right then in 1962. We wouldn't be here now. Today, we don't know what is going on in Putin's mind or in the minds of his inner circle. We don't know for sure what the red lines are, and therefore we don't know if we're getting close to crossing them. And the same, on their side. They don't know. I mean, we try to communicate, but it's a war. We don't know exactly what's going on. Mm-hmm. And once the fighting starts, things are almost by definition out of control. And that's the situation which we find ourselves in.
Now, coming out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had a couple of positive things like the hotline that allowed the US president to talk to, at that time, the Soviet president. Now, we don't see that kind of conversation happening between President Biden and President Putin right now.
No, although there was a conversation just a couple of days ago with Defense Secretary Austin was in touch with his Russian counterpart. And the means of having a conversation are there. Biden and Putin will be together at the G20 meeting. They've both said independently they don't intend to talk to the other, but I think it's almost certain that there will be some kind of conversation that goes on there. So there is some communication, and that's good. But even so, there's so much room for misunderstanding in a situation as intense as the war in Ukraine right now, and as fluid and as rapidly changing. And it remains, therefore, extraordinarily dangerous. We could easily stumble into an escalation that nobody wants. The great parable that's always gets cited is the summer of 1914, when nobody in Europe really wanted World War I, but we ended up with it anyway because no one knew how to control events once they got started. And that fear, I think, should be hovering over us all right now. We have a very dangerous situation that is really out of control. Nobody knows what the exit ramp would be for Putin to stop the war. I think most people around the world agree that the war has to stop and that Russian aggression and Russian nuclear blackmail cannot be rewarded, but no one really knows how to bring this to a conclusion.
Now, another thing that came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty.
Right.
And then we've had several treaties since then, going up through recent years. But it seems like almost all of those have been dismantled by recent administrations.
Yeah, the only treaty currently extant directly between the United States and Russia is the New START Treaty, which President Biden was able to get extended soon after he took office, but which will expire again in 2026. That's a bad situation. There are not significant treaty restraints. It brings us to, I think, the nux of the problem, which is we need a new treaty. We have a treaty that's very important, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which has brought together a large portion of the international community, but it has not involved the countries that actually have the weapons. And that's partly because the TPNW, Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, doesn't specify the verification procedures, the enforcement procedures, the timetable for eliminating nuclear weapons. And when that treaty was being negotiated, that was clearly understood, that those details were still to be worked out. And what the Back from the Brink campaign here in the United States that I'm involved with is advocating is that the US initiate that process now, that we sit down with the other 8 nuclear-armed states and negotiate a treaty with enforcement and verification provisions and a timetable for actually eliminating the weapons, so that all countries that have nuclear weapons can eliminate their arsenals and come into compliance with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The moment may seem very unfavorable, given what's going on in Ukraine, but as you mentioned, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, nobody anticipated the degree of cooperation that would result just a few months later. And sometimes these global near-death experiences have a way of focusing people's attention. And I think it's possible, by no means certain, but possible, that in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, if we are able to bring this to a conclusion, the leadership on both sides will be appropriately sobered by how close we have come to nuclear war, and be willing, therefore, to undertake some fresh thinking about what we need to do with our nuclear weapons, and that could lead to a successful conclusion of a treaty that actually eliminates them.
Now, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is a United Nations instrument, right? It
Correct.
passed in 2017, I think, in the
That's
United
correct.
Nations, but the United States is still not a signatory to that document.
None of the nations that have nuclear weapons are signatories to the treaty, nor are any of the countries in NATO which exist under the US nuclear umbrella, nor are South Korea, Japan, or Australia, which exist under the US nuclear umbrella in the Pacific. And that is the weakness of the treaty. The treaty and its adherents and its proponents are working to overcome that by bringing more countries into the treaty and by trying to apply effective pressure in the nuclear-armed states, in NATO, in Japan and Australia and South Korea, so that they will recognize that the treaty is in their interest. And the problem is that the countries that have nuclear weapons now still are enthralled to this myth that nuclear weapons somehow make them safe.
Mm-hmm.
And what they need to understand is that the nuclear weapons that they possess are the greatest threat to their security. Lee Butler, who was the commander of the strategic forces in the US in the early 1990s, has famously said that there's only one thing in the world that the US military can't protect America from, and that's nuclear weapons in the hands of an enemy. And therefore, it has to be the US's highest security priority to get rid of those weapons in the hands of other countries. And the only way we can do that is by being willing to give up our weapons as well as part of the process. That logic applies to every one of the nuclear-armed states. And if we can get the leadership to understand that, there is the basis there, at least, for reaching the kind of agreement that we need. Because, the problem is, we have gotten this far in the nuclear weapons era largely because we've been lucky. It's not because we've had wise leaders or sound military doctrine or infallible technology. We've lacked all of those at one time or another. We've been lucky. Robert McNamara said, I'm quoting him, "We lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war." And we have to recognize that that's the situation. We're only here today because we've been extraordinarily lucky. And our luck is not going to last forever. Sooner or later, these weapons are going to be used if we don't get rid of them.
Talk about the work that you're doing with International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War and other groups, and particularly this Back from the Brink campaign. What are your sort of points of influence on these issues, and what do you hope that listeners and viewers will get involved in?
I mean, I think the Back from the Brink campaign here in the United States is the most important and potentially useful vehicle that we have been able to create since the freeze campaign of the 1980s to bring about change in U.S. nuclear policy. It's modeled in some ways on the freeze.
Right, and let's talk about that for a moment. The nuclear weapons freeze campaign of the 1980s resulted in nationwide referenda, organizing, and ultimately in changing the way that both the United States and the Soviet Union related to their nuclear weapons arsenals.
Exactly. What we did in the United States was to put forward a prescription for what U.S. nuclear policy should be, get people all around the country to endorse that prescription, and effectively created a national consensus that we needed to stop the Cold War arms race. We needed to freeze it. The Back from the Brink campaign is built around this call for negotiations for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons, and we're doing the same kind of organizing. We're approaching cities, towns across the country. We're approaching state legislatures. We have a resolution in Congress. We have gone to all kinds of civil society organizations, faith communities, professional associations, peace groups, social justice groups, labor unions, urging them to endorse this campaign. And so far, about, I think it's 420, something in that range, organizations around the country have endorsed the campaign. More than 60 cities, including Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Honolulu, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, Tucson, and many others have endorsed this campaign. And we are hoping to replicate the success of the freeze to create a national consensus that we need to get rid of nuclear weapons, that we need to begin these negotiations. We've introduced a bill in Congress. Congressman McGovern from Massachusetts and Congressman Blumenauer from Oregon have introduced HRES, House Resolution 1185, calling for the U.S. to adopt the Back from the Brink prescription. And we hope to promote that in the Senate as well. We're working with a number of colleagues in the Senate to try to get a companion resolution introduced into the Senate. And the hope is that if we get enough people to endorse this platform, we effectively create a national consensus. We give the administration permission, if you will, to follow our advice. And we also put some pressure on them to follow our advice. And that's what worked for the freeze. We have every reason to believe it can work again now.
Dr. Ira Helfand, the immediate past president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War and currently on the steering committee of the Back from the Brink campaign. Thank you so much for speaking with us today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.